The 10 o'clock news is closed captioned for our hearing-impaired viewers. We are grateful to Dunkin' Donuts and Bull Worldwide Information Systems for making this important service possible.
I'm Carmen Fields. Tonight on the 10 o'clock news, drug officers bust up what they say is a violent drug ring operating in Boston. The Scheme Z scenario. Some of its designers say it's not really the best plan. Paul Mahoney will get a new job. He moves from the Senate President's office to Malden District Court. And the train collision in Boston. Transportation inspectors were in 3 years ago for a similar accident. What are they expected to find now? Our guest will be James King, formerly with the National Transportation Safety Board.
The 10 o'clock news is made possible by your contributions and by grants from Nimrod Press, printers and engravers. From New England Telephone, 30,000 people serving New England's communications needs for more than 100 years. And from Shawmut, providers of financial services at more than 200 locations across Massachusetts.
Federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies teamed up today against what they say is one of Boston's most violent drug gangs. The alleged kingpin of that gang is Darrell Whiting. The 10 o'clock news introduced you to him in a broadcast last summer. Meg Valancourt reports on Whiting's reputed drug and gun trafficking and today's arrests.
Where you going?
Today's drug busts ended in 22 arrests, and there are warrants out for at least 10 more people. The charges include trafficking in cocaine, crack, marijuana, and the illegal distribution of guns.
Back off, see if we can get them to get on the other end, will you?
At noon today, federal, state, and local police hit 8 different locations in Dorchester and Roxbury. They seized money, drugs, and at least 8 guns, including an Uzi submachine gun. But their main target was this place, the Crown Club on Geneva Avenue.
This is one of the points of operation. There have been a number of buys in this situation, and
Drug buys.
Drug buys and weapon buys.
After arresting several men here, police struggled to capture 6 pit bulls guarding the club. According to today's indictment, the club's owner ran a violent gang that made millions of dollars selling drugs and guns. His name is Darrell Whiting. He wasn't here today. But when we went to the club to investigate reports of drug trafficking last spring, we met him.
The word on the street is that this is a place where gangs meet and where drugs are dealt.
Oh, shit.
Will you tell me what's happening here, truthfully?
No, that's a bunch of guys who that's a bunch of false rumors.
I'm sorry,
That's a bunch of false rumors.
it's rumors.
Last May, we reported that police suspected Whiting of running a gang out of the Crown Club. And in fact, though the sign on the door said closed, we recorded several young men in shiny cars stopping at the club last spring. Each went inside, but stayed for only a few minutes. They emerged and drove off. We knew that Whiting was a former felon who had moved to Boston 3 years ago. He claimed he cleaned up his act. But police told us he wanted to be the godfather of Boston's gangs. Whiting denied it.
If anything, they may come to me for certain advice or certain problems I may, if I cannot help them out with. But that's about the extent of my relationship with them. I'm not in control of any gangs involved.
What do you think about the gang problem in Boston?
I think it's terrible.
Is it possible to go in, Darrell?
Sure, you can come.
After a 10-minute delay so that someone could, quote, clean up, Whiting let us in. Once inside, we saw several younger children playing pool and a few older men watching them. But the teenage boys we'd seen running in and out just a few moments before were gone. We asked Whiting about the rumors that he was using teens to deal drugs.
No.
No, not
Because we were waiting outside. We saw a lot of kids come. They spent 5 minutes here and they left. What might they be doing?
Just coming to see who's in there or what we doing here today.
That was last spring. Today, Whiting wasn't at his social club. He was convicted last month of assault and battery and is serving time in Deer Island Prison. So he wasn't in Dorchester today to watch drug enforcement agents raid his rec hall and other businesses, or see them arrest people police say were Whiting's partners. On the streets, Whiting's nickname is God.
But it's a cocaine ring. It's a gun trafficking ring. That's what they were about. And they, Mr. Whiting, as I say, assumed a rather lofty position in the organization because he was known as God.
And according to federal officials, when business associates crossed him, Whiting would get violent.
Mr. Whiting did perpetrate acts of violence and kept his own members of his organization in line through acts of intimidation.
The 8 drug busts today were followed by a press conference in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Members of the Special Federal Drug Task Force expressed outrage that the Whiting organization used children to distribute drugs.
We had an individual who was trying to convince children that this type of drug trafficking and all this stuff was a good thing to do. Wayne said it best. He thought he was God. Well, I'm going to tell you, he was an evil person.
Whiting is already in jail, but if he's convicted on the new drug and gun charges, he faces another 40 to 60 years in prison. He'll be indicted later this week. For the 10 o'clock news, I'm Meg Valancourt.
And now Scheme Z. Plunk a 16-lane highway interchange on the banks of an urban river, and you can bet the environmental alarms will go off. And so they are, now that state transportation officials say Scheme Z is the best way to the depressed Central Artery, to Storrow Drive, I-93, and the Tobin Bridge. Scheme Z supporters say it passes environmental muster. Even some environmental groups give it qualified support, but not all. John Hashimoto has part 2 of our special look at all the fuss around Scheme Z.
For those of you still confused, this is where Scheme Z would rear its ugly head. Technically, it's known as a transportation corridor, home not only to the MBT North Station commuter tracks, but also Boston Sand and Gravel. From this view, it may not look like such a bad place to put an interchange. But then again, Scheme Z, seen here in scale model form, is not your everyday run-of-the-mill interchange.
Well, Scheme Z itself, as you know, is a superstructure. It's a 10-story high, 16-lane highway that loops back into a 28-lane crossing of the river that we see in back of us.
Critics like Caroline Simmons are coming out of the woodwork on Scheme Z because it could get a green light from Environmental Affairs Secretary John DeVillers any day now. The Big Z isn't a plan that just appeared recently, by the way. It was picked as the best interchange blueprint the state could come up with back in 1987. 30 other proposals were studied and rejected. But the closer Scheme Z comes to reality, the more questions are being asked about its cause and effect.
It's basically taken the problem of the elevated Central Artery downtown and shifted it over to the citizens of Charlestown and Cambridge.
Then how could Scheme Z come as far as it did if it's so obviously bad for the environment? Well, for one, it's not clear that Scheme Z will be an environmental disaster, although most agree it will be an aesthetic one. State transportation officials, the chief backers of the plan, maintain it will actually improve air quality in the area, that noise pollution will be no more noticeable, and that they have reduced the impact the loop-de-loop span will have on water quality. So what environmentalists like Karen Pelto are more concerned about is Scheme Z's impact on a long-standing grand plan to make this area another strip of Charles River parkland.
The Millers River, which is just behind us, is a resource protected by the State Wetlands Protection Act. It will be filled with 13 concrete piers to support the highway, which will be directly above it, causing severe shading impacts as well as filling.
Yet Karen Pelto's concern has been essentially relegated to a murmur in the Scheme Z process, and that's because some other environmental groups have given the plan qualified support. That's where the word mitigation comes in.
When we first started becoming concerned about Scheme Z, we asked about alternatives, and the DPW was only ready to talk mitigation with us from the word go.
In the world of mega public works projects, mitigation is the magic potion of compromise. If a project disrupts the environment in one area, the builders offer to make the environment better in another. In the case of the Central Artery project, Artery officials have agreed to spend $75 million for improvements of the Charles River Basin as mitigation for all the damage to be done. They've even promised to put a pedestrian park underneath the Scheme Z span.
I consider a lot of the mitigation proposals that they have come up with to be compensation. It will improve other areas of the lower basin if the promise is kept, but it will in no way lessen the impact of this very massive highway crossing.
But another environmental group, the respected Conservation Law Foundation, believes mitigation promises derived from the Central Artery project are so significant that it is giving qualified support to Scheme Z. The foundation told the 10 o'clock news tonight that if the state follows through on promises to make significant improvements in Boston's mass